All right, good afternoon. We're going to get started. I want to welcome you all and thank you for being here today. I am Dr. Kay Stefanik, Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. This is our second seminar in our fall series, Trends in Surface and Groundwater Nutrients Across the U.S. Our speaker today is Lori Sprague with USGS. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items. This is a hybrid meeting. For those of you who are online, you can type your questions into the chat box and I will ask them to Lori at the end of her presentation. For those of you who are in the room in Ealings Hall, we'll have a time at the end where you can ask your questions directly. And this webinar will be recorded and it will eventually be posted to the Iowa Nutrient Research Center's website. So today, our speaker is Lori Sprague, the National Program Manager for Integrated Water Availability Assessments with the U.S. Geological Survey. She is going to be presenting on long-term nutrient trends from the Mississippi River Basin to the Gulf of Mexico. So with that, the floor is yours, Lori.
Thanks, Kay. And let me switch over here to presentation mode. I want to thank Kay and Matt for giving me this opportunity to talk with you all today. Your seminar series is one of my very favorite topics, and so I'm thrilled to be here to add to the conversation about it. As Kay mentioned, I am a hydrologist at the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm a national program manager for our integrated water availability assessments. And as part of that program, we look at long-term trends across the United States in water quality constituents, water quantity, the water budget components, and different types of water uses. But today I'm here in a different capacity in my role as the U.S. Department of the Interior representative on the Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Task Force, which I'll tell you a little bit more about today. The role of the USGS on that task force is to conduct long-term monitoring in the lower Mississippi River Basin to track progress toward the task force nutrient reduction goals. To start out, I'll give you a little background on the issue. And for those of you who aren't familiar, hypoxia is basically oxygen depletion. It's an environmental phenomenon whereby the concentrations of dissolved oxygen in the water decreases to a level that can't support aquatic organisms. Now, hypoxia does occur naturally in many environments around the world, but it is increasing worldwide in coastal and estuarine areas as largely a result of human activities. The largest hypoxic zone in the United States and the second largest in the world is it forms in the northern Gulf of Mexico each summer. Specifically, it's forming to the west of the Mississippi and Atchafalaya River deltas. So you can see that in this graph or this map right here. USGS a while back had done some research using sediment cores recovered from the Louisiana shelf, and they found that hypoxic conditions in the northern Gulf of Mexico may have existed intermittently as far back as the late 1800s. So there is some natural component to the formation of the hypoxic zone. Those results also indicated that hypoxic conditions during the last few decades have been more extreme than any that occurred in the previous 150 years. The first direct observation of the existence of the hypoxic zone was in the early 1970s, and at that time, evidence suggests it was happening maybe every 2 to 3 years. Since then, NOAA and its partners have been conducting annual shelf-wide cruises to directly measure the size of the zone, and that's been happening since the late 80s, and they're finding that it's occurring annually now. The average size of the hypoxic zone over the past 5 years is about 4,500 square miles, which is similar in area to the state of Connecticut. The reasons that we care about hypoxia are both the environmental and the economic implications. So hypoxia can affect valuable fisheries and disrupt sensitive ecosystems by reducing the extent and the quality of habitat for a large variety of organisms. It has many lethal and sublethal effects. So we're talking about increased mortality, reduced growth, changes in migration patterns, changes in reproductive success, all of which can culminate in economic impacts to local industry. So back in 2020, NOAA reported, as an example of this, that the commercial fishery landings in the Gulf generate $5.5 billion in annual income and support approximately 150,000 jobs. Recreational fishing generates another 1.6 billion in annual income and supports approximately 44,000 jobs. The Gulf's seafood industry accounts for more than 40% of the nation's seafood. Louisiana alone is second only to Alaska in seafood production. In particular, about 80% of US shrimp landings come from the Gulf of Mexico, and shrimp are particularly sensitive to hypoxia. When the hypoxic zone is present, shrimpers need to travel further and spend more time to find the shrimp, and it has an economic impact for that reason. Hypoxia is in the Gulf of Mexico is primarily caused by excess nutrients that are coming from non-point sources of the basin, and that are transported to the Gulf from throughout the Mississippi River watershed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those sources are and where they're coming from later in the presentation. But the excess nutrients that reach the Gulf of Mexico are causing extensive growth of algae that deplete the oxygen in the water when they die, sink to the bottom, and decompose. That condition is intensified by the stratification that results from warm water coming off the continent and overlying this colder saline water in the Gulf, which prevents mixing and turnover in the water, and that prevents oxygen-rich surface water from getting down into the oxygen-depleted bottom water. We have seen years, and this is a particularly timely observation, where the size of the hypoxic zone is pretty severely disrupted by hurricanes and tropical storms and other systems in the Gulf of Mexico. But we have seen that once that happens, the hypoxic zone does form up again during the spring and summer pretty quickly after the storms pass through. Now, I mentioned that I am the DOI representative on the coordinating committee of the Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Task Force. This task force and you can read the slide here, but it basically was established in 1998 to provide support for various actions undertaken by member agencies that help mitigate some of the causes and impacts that I was talking about relative to hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. The task force includes both federal and state agencies, and federal agencies include those with a responsibility over activities in the Mississippi River Basin. And it also includes the 12 states in the orange boundary here you see on the map that are critical partners in managing nutrients reaching the Gulf of Mexico. Each of those states has developed a nutrient reduction strategy through stakeholder participation that serves as a roadmap for implementing nutrient reductions in their state. And they're all a little bit different and reflect the individual priority of those states, but they all share a commitment to helping to address hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. As part of the work the task force has been doing, they have set goals for reducing the size of the hypoxic zone. This graph is showing the measured size of the hypoxic zone since back in 1985. And you can see the 5-year moving average as that dotted line. The task force has set a goal for reducing the 5-year average hypoxic zone to 1,900 square miles or smaller by 2035. And that horizontal dotted line shows the size of the zone at the goal. And you can see right now we are still above that goal. The task force also recognizes the need to set some nutrient reduction targets because of the role of nutrients in contributing to the formation of Gulf hypoxia. So the nutrient reduction targets that they have set are for nitrogen and phosphorus to reduce those by 20% by 2025. That's an interim target. And then 45% by 2035. That 45% is based on a number of modeling studies that have indicated that both nitrogen and phosphorus need to be reduced by 45% to reach the target size of the hypoxic zone. On the right-hand side here in the graph, I'm showing annual total nitrogen loads to the Gulf of Mexico. These are based on long-term observational records from USGS monitoring in the lower Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers since the late 1970s. The task force sets those percentage reduction targets based on a baseline average load between 1980 and 1996. So you can see the horizontal black line here is showing where we are measuring our progress against. The 20% reduction target and the 45% reduction target relative to that baseline are shown on here. And you can see that there are some years where the load to the Gulf of Mexico was actually below that 45% reduction target. And you might think, look, we did what we set out to do, we're done, we've accomplished our goals. The complicating factor here is that if you look at annual stream flow coming from the Mississippi River Basin into the Gulf of Mexico every year, superimposed on that time series of loads, you'll see that every year in which we have a low load, we also have a low stream flow. And that's because there's less precipitation, there's less water moving through the basin, carrying fewer nutrients to the Gulf of Mexico. That is, by and large, natural interannual variability. It is not because of anything that we are deliberately doing to control the amount of nutrients reaching the Gulf of Mexico. So we want to be able to look at the trend in nitrogen and phosphorus independent of those interannual variations in stream flow. If we can look at that trend independent of those variables that we can't control, it helps us understand more about the changes in load that are occurring due to other factors that are maybe more influenced by us, such as nutrient management. Here is the most recent results available for total nitrogen, and you can see the blue line is the trend line. It's our what we call a flow normalized trended load. That flow normalized term refers to looking at the change independent of that largely random interannual variability in load. And what you'll see here is that there has been a general decline over time. There is some uncertainty in our estimates because these are based on a model. And so the 90% confidence interval is shown around the best estimate of the trend line in solid blue. And in fact, what we've seen is that we are actually reaching below that 20% reduction target starting around the year 2020. Now, the story is different for phosphorus, and this is what I'm showing here. The line now, you can see there was a small decrease in the 80s and 90s. Then there was an increase, and it's been relatively stable since then. And we are now still above that interim reduction target. And in fact, have seen a very small increase between that baseline period and 2022. One of the questions that we've asked ourselves in looking at these results is why might there be a difference in the behavior of nitrogen versus phosphorus at this large basin scale? So we undertook a study that was published, the URL is on the bottom of the slide here, by my colleagues Sarah Stackpool and Robert Sabo at EPA, looking at some potential factors affecting the trends that we observed. On the top plot here, we're looking at some of the most significant sources of nitrogen in the Mississippi River Basin, estimated back through the 1950s. The largest source is estimated to be farm fertilizer. Another large source is nitrogen fixation from things like soybeans. Livestock manure is also on there. We also have atmospheric deposition of industrial emissions and fertilizer volatilization. wastewater, treated wastewater discharge and urban fertilizer use shown on that top plot. And you get a sense here both of the relative magnitude of those sources and also how they have individually been changing over time. And among one of the more striking results on that, of course, is the large increase in fertilizer use since the creation of synthetic fertilizer back in the late 40s. We wanted to compare that information with what is targeted by our application of particularly farm fertilizer and in some cases livestock manure, which is crops, fertilizing our crops. And you can see there was a coincident increase in crop yields and crop uptake during that period of time in which we were applying more fertilizer and had more fixation and slightly more livestock manure. Of interest is how does the magnitude of all of these sources summed up compare to the magnitude that's taken up by crops? What is that balance between inputs and outputs? Are we taking everything that we're applying on the land surface up through crops, or is there excess remaining that can be a source of runoff to the river and ultimately to the Gulf of Mexico? So this is that balance where we summed up the inputs and subtracted the outputs to get at a very large scale an estimate of how much excess nitrogen there was each year in the Mississippi River Basin. And you can see that since as far back as we've been able to estimate, that balance has been positive. That is, we've been applying more than we have been able to estimate has been taken up in crops. That means there's been a balance of excess nutrients in the basin that's available to run off to the river. Of note here, you can see there was a pretty rapid increase in that surplus through about the mid 80s. Then it started to pretty significantly level off, which is a sign that even though the balance is still positive, we've had success in stemming that rapid increase and have reached a plateau and a stable point. Then we took that time series of the balance between inputs and outputs and compared it to what we saw in the river. If in fact we have excess nutrients, a surplus of nutrients in the Mississippi River Basin, are we seeing a corresponding pattern in the amount of nutrients in the river each year? Now our time series don't go as far back. Our observational records don't go as far back for river loads, but you can see where we do have some overlap. There is a clear correspondence between the amount of nitrogen in the river. This is now in the lower Mississippi River reaching the Gulf of Mexico. It matches that increase in the surplus of nitrogen until around the late 1980s, where we started to see these two time series behave differently. So the surplus of nitrogen, it was leveling off, but it was still increasing a bit, while there was a fairly rapid decrease in the amount of nitrogen reaching the river, and then it leveled off. If we go through that same exercise for phosphorus, again, you'll see in that top plot there, farm fertilizer is a large source, livestock manure is a fairly large source as well, and fertilizer has been increasing over time. We also have natural sources of phosphorus, geologic sources of phosphorus that can be weathered and reach the streams and rivers. We have treated wastewater discharge, and we have urban fertilizer use there. And then on the bottom, again, we're showing crop uptake. Comparing those two, it looks a little bit different from nitrogen, where we had that same increase through 1980-ish, and then there was a strong decrease, and since then it's leveled out. It is still positive, but it's gone down and then leveled out, and maybe going up just a little bit recently. Now, comparing that surplus, that trended surplus, to what we were seeing in the river, and again, there was some correspondence between the behavior of the surplus and the behavior over time of what we were seeing in the river until the late 1980s. And then there was a difference. So we saw that decrease in the surplus, but there was an increase in the river load at some point in that latter period after 1985 that was different. Of course, the million-dollar question there is why? Why are we seeing that difference in nitrogen and phosphorus? What caused that on the landscape? And I have up here a number of possible factors. When operating in a basin of this size, there's a lot going on at the same time, which makes it really important to be able to identify all of these possible factors and then be able to quantify their behavior over time to start to be able to discriminate between them and avoid any misspecification of the cause of a trend. The challenge that we are faced with in tackling this question at the scale of the Mississippi River Basin is that for a lot of these factors, we don't have data going back very far in time. We don't have data that are consistently collected or estimated across the basin. And it makes it really difficult to say definitively, these are the things that have contributed to the trends that I just showed you in what we were seeing in reaching the Gulf of Mexico. We do know that from a lot of really great science that all of the things that I'm showing on the screen, plus probably quite a bit more, is affecting nutrients that are moving from the land surface to rivers. So are potentially factors in affecting that trend over time that I showed you in load. So a number of agricultural practices that are designed to reduce the amount of nutrients reaching rivers, low and no-till practices, cover crops, livestock manure management, riparian buffers, changing the way and the amounts that we're irrigating, changing the amounts and the timing of our fertilizer application. These are all factors that have been shown to be very successful at a field scale in reducing the amount of nutrients that are running off the land surface into rivers. But we don't have great data on a lot of these things going back in time. Some of these also have been shown to increase the amount of nutrient transport to streams. So no-till can actually contribute to the accumulation of phosphorus in the upper layers of the soil, which are most susceptible to runoff. Tile drains can act as a faster conduit of nitrogen and sometimes phosphorus to rivers because it's bypassing the groundwater system. We do know that legacy nutrients are an issue where over decades of fertilizer use, we've seen fertilizer accumulate in the soil and act as an ongoing reservoir of phosphorus. We know that some of the nitrogen from fertilizer has entered the groundwater system and is returning much more slowly to rivers in the basin over timescales. We're talking months to many decades for nitrogen that was originally applied on the land surface to reach streams through groundwater. We have a lot of urban efforts to manage nutrients. So things like stormwater controls to manage urban runoff, stormwater runoff, as well as many technology upgrades to wastewater treatment that have been shown to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that are being just discharged directly to rivers from wastewater treatment plants. And of course, a big elephant in the room is climate change. We've seen evidence that in certain parts of the basin, we're having earlier and more frequent precipitation events, and the intensity of rainfall can affect the amount of sediment that's carried in runoff. The timing of the rainfall relative to fertilizer application can also be a consideration with how much of the applied nutrients are being transported to rivers. So that's an active area of research with a lot of unanswered questions as well. So based on our understanding from the input and output balance that I showed you, we developed some models of the relationship between that and river loads and asked, using those models, if the surplus between nutrient inputs and crop uptake had been the only thing affecting the amount of nutrients in the river and therefore the loading to the Gulf of Mexico, And none of these other things that I just showed you on the last slide had been in place. If it was only the balance between inputs and outputs affecting what was in the rivers, what would we have seen? And this is a counterfactual analysis. We know this did not actually happen, but what we're saying is, to the best of our ability to estimate this, if we hadn't taken any steps to manage nutrients, and all we had was that surplus of nutrients, what would we have seen? And that counterfactual analysis showed us that nitrogen loads would have been approximately 2 times higher in 2017 than they actually were if we hadn't done any of those things on the last slide. So this is an important thing to note, that while we haven't seen the types of reductions that we really want to see to this point, we have made progress, that things would have been worse had we not done whatever combination of things we have done in the basin between 1975 and in our ending of the study here in 2017. Phosphorus loads, on the other hand, would have been similar today, or 2017, to what they were than what actually occurred. And that's because not that phosphorus hasn't been changing, not that balance in phosphorus hasn't been changing, but because it improved for a while, it got better. And then sometime around 1990, late 1980s, it started to go up again. So we had an improvement, and then we started to see it go in the opposite direction. I want to delve a little bit now into the specific sources, the geographic sources of nitrogen reaching the Gulf of Mexico. These are results from Dale Robertson and Dave Sade at USGS from the Sparrow model, showing the yields of nitrogen delivered to the Gulf of Mexico from different parts of the Mississippi River Basin. So this is not showing the local load in an individual stream reach. It is showing of what reached a local stream reach, how much of that made it downstream to the Gulf of Mexico. The darker brown areas are areas of higher loading. So first of all, you can see over in the western part of the basin, where I am right now, there's not a lot reaching the Gulf of Mexico from this part of the basin. And that's in part because it's just further away. It's in part because we have fewer people, less agriculture over here. It's also in part because we have several large main stem reservoirs between us and the Gulf of Mexico that trap nutrients. The larger contributors geographically to the Mississippi River Basin for nitrogen are those upper Midwest states in the Corn Belt region. You break those down by the type of source, and this is consistent with some of the earlier plots I showed you that were in time series form. If you traced the nitrogen reaching the Gulf of Mexico all the way back up to its various sources and looked at the breakdown of the type of source, this is what you would see. Between fertilizer, manure, and nitrogen fixing crops, we're talking about, at least half of the nitrogen, over half of the nitrogen coming from agriculture. 5% is coming from treated wastewater discharge, 2% from urban runoff, and then another third from atmospheric deposition, again, that originates as industrial emissions or fertilizer volatilization. Now, this is at the Gulf of Mexico. If you trace it back up, you will see that there are localized areas throughout the Mississippi River Basin, including some of these areas out where I am, where wastewater discharge locally is actually the largest source in the one that gets the most focus in terms of nutrient management. So this graph here of what's reaching the Gulf is not to suggest that some of these smaller sources are not important throughout the basin, but this is just showing the breakdown of the nitrogen that's reaching the Gulf of Mexico. This is now a similar plot or similar map for phosphorus. It looks somewhat similar. That western half of the basin, again, not a large contributor to the Gulf of Mexico, although there are of course issues locally. Now this is showing again that the upper Midwest is a large contributor to the Gulf of Mexico, but it's also picking up more from the lower Mississippi basin. And that is in part because those are areas where there are more natural sources of phosphorus and there's more weathering that's contributing to the load that's reaching the Gulf. Here's the breakdown of the phosphorus reaching the Gulf. Again, agriculture is the largest source between manure and fertilizer. We've got proportionally more coming from wastewater discharge and other urban sources. And then we've got these so-called natural sources, which can be in large part those geologic sources of phosphorus. If you're interested in looking in more detail at these results, we do have them online. I'll also mention that we are right now in the process of updating the Sparrow model through more current conditions, and we're anticipating that those will be released sometime late next year. But right now, as a resource, you can go in here and look at this, the Sparrow model results, both from the perspective of contributions to the Gulf of Mexico, and if you're more interested in local water quality, looking at that instead to see things in your area. I want to show also some trend results we have for other parts of the basin. So up until now, I've been focusing on that lower Mississippi site toward the confluence with the Gulf of Mexico. But of course, that is a reflection of all of the things that are happening upstream. And there is a real mix here. Nitrogen loads, if you look basin-wide, I'll note here this particular data set is interagency, so it's partly USGS data, but it's also partly data that we have from the water quality portal that's made public from a large variety of other agencies doing critical long-term monitoring. And those data sets have been screened for characteristics suitable for trend analysis, so length of record, completeness of record, coverage of seasons and high flow conditions as well as low flow conditions, so that there's probably other data that's out there that isn't as long-term or doesn't have high flow or whatever that is not showing up here. But of what we have available, we've seen a mix here. And this is from a recent study by my USGS colleague, Jenny Murphy, who I actually think is on the call today. And it's looking at trends between 2002 and 2017. So a slightly different period than I've been showing you up to this point. But there is a mix. There are a wide variety of declining nitrogen trends that's consistent with what we've seen over time at the lower Mississippi, but there are also a number of areas that are showing increases in total nitrogen. The main thing I want you to take away from this plot is that the results of the lower Mississippi are an aggregate of everything going upstream, but it's not uniform behavior throughout the basin. There are some areas where we're making progress and other areas where we are not. This is also true for phosphorus. So you can see in the lower Mississippi, there are areas where we don't have a lot of monitoring records, but those areas where the Sparrow model is showing us there are some larger phosphorus sources proportionally relative to nitrogen. We're seeing some increases down in those areas, whereas in some of those high contributing upper Midwest areas, we're actually seeing some recent decreases in phosphorus. So while we haven't seen large decreases coincident in the lower Mississippi site, this is evidence that, again, there are areas of the basin where we are making progress with phosphorus. So the question that needs to be answered is, yes, we're making progress in some areas, but what is preventing that from scaling up to being realized at the Gulf of Mexico? And what can we learn from these results, and what does that say about how we should be adaptively managing? Okay, I wanted to show you some other types of trends that the USGS has been working on. This is from results from Jeff Hauser and Kathy Jo Jankowski in USGS, looking at the upper Mississippi River Basin. Back in 1986, the Water Resources Development Act created the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program to monitor and rehabilitate the upper Mississippi River system. And this is administered by the Corps of Engineers. but is implemented through a broad partnership of multiple federal and state agencies. And USGS is providing the scientific leadership for the long-term resource monitoring elements of this program. And they partner with state agencies to conduct a field data collection and get their expertise in assessing those data. So they look at long-term records of water quality, fish, and aquatic vegetation, and 6 study reaches of the upper Mississippi River system. So I'm going to focus here showing you some of the results. This is just going to give you a flavor of the overall type of results here. This was a very detailed, comprehensive study. I don't have, unfortunately, time to talk about it all, but I wanted to give you a flavor of it in case you wanted to go see more of the results in the report that is shown at the bottom of the slide. But I'll note here this focus on parts of Minnesota where we saw a pattern consistent with other areas of the upper Mississippi River Basin with reductions in suspended solid and phosphorus. And this was coincident with a decrease in total suspended solids from major tributaries, also coincident with increases in vegetation, which may have decreased sediment resuspension. Here, the authors found that there were at least 3 possible reasons for the strong declines in phosphorus they were seeing there. First, between 2000 and 2005, the Metropolitan Wastewater Treatment Plant in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is upstream from these, implemented improved wastewater treatment capacity that removed a lot more phosphorus. Second, they had reductions in several of the tributaries. And last, the reductions in suspended sediment likely contributed because phosphorus is attaching to the soil particles. A few other selected things I'll mention. They looked at several types of aquatic vegetation and found that submerged aquatic vegetation in this area I'm showing here increased and then plateaued. And this was after they had some high flow conditions there that built some resiliency in the system. I'll also mention for fish, they saw for invasive species, one concern up there is big-headed carp. They had found that had not established self-sustaining populations, and they were seeing increases in some of the other types of fish that were of interest. And again, I would encourage you, there's just too much here for me to get into in detail, but I would encourage you, if you're interested in these parts of the Mississippi River Basin and a little more detail on the interaction between changes in water quality, changes in aquatic vegetation, and changes in fisheries, to take a look at this very comprehensive and well-done study. Okay. I'm going to end there. Thank you for your time and attention. I know we have time for questions, but I am going to go now, Kay, to the 2 slides you asked me to include, just so the audience here is aware of the next seminars coming up.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that great presentation. So all of our seminars are recorded and posted online, and they can be found either at this QR code or at the web address. Then if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. Our next seminar is November 13th. 3:10 to 4 p.m. Jimmy Weber with USGS, he is going to be talking about nutrient and sediment loads measured from the Chesapeake Bay River Input Monitoring Network. All right, so we have a couple questions online. How about we take those real quick and then we'll go to people in person. All right, so the first question, there could be facilities that are located in one subbasin but are discharging treated wastewater in another subbasin. How does the EPA or USGS keep track of such facilities that are located in one subbasin but have outfalls in another?
We get our data that we use in the models that I was showing results from in the presentation from the EPA database, I believe it's called ISIS, that compiles information from different facilities on their discharge flow rates and discharge concentrations over time. So in that case, it would really come down to how the facility itself is reporting the information. To the extent that we can, if we are aware that The discharge location is, oh, y'all can't see this, I'm getting a reboot notice. Let's hope we can at least get through this without a rebooting. So if we are aware that the reporting location is tied to, the administrative office, it doesn't match the discharge location, we can go in there and manually alter that before we calibrate and apply our models, but we don't always know that information. So we do what we can to improve the time series, but we largely rely on the reporting from the facilities through EPA.
And then the data you provided is based on stream discharge. Is there any ongoing monitoring or modeling efforts that have looked specifically at groundwater and how groundwater discharge may play into that?
Yes, we have been approaching that from a number of different angles. So Jenny Murphy, who was the lead author on the basin-wide trend study that I showed you, she and I worked together on a publication a while back that separated the time series of surface water loads in different locations throughout the basin into high flow, kind of average flows, and low flows, which, if there are no significant point sources, is going to be representative of base flow contributions. And in this case, it was of nitrate. And we did see through that sort of indirect estimation process that there were places throughout the Mississippi River Basin where we were seeing kind of overall increases in nitrate in the river, but big increases in that base flow portion. So not so much at high flow, not so much at average flows, but much more at base flow. So in those situations, that can be an indication that the overall increase that we're seeing in the river is not so much from increases in runoff, because perhaps there hasn't been a corresponding change of precipitation, or they've been actively putting in things like riparian buffers, and that more of it was coming from potentially lagged inputs in groundwater. So one of the places, for example, where we saw some of the largest changes was in the outlet of the Missouri River Basin coming in from that western part of the basin. We also have other efforts going on to estimate the percentage of base flow now consistently throughout the basin, to at least see where do we even have large amounts of water coming in from groundwater. If you're in an area where there's not a lot of base flow contributions, it's probably not going to be a big factor. So that's one of the things we want to understand, is where are the areas where we're actually seeing more in the river coming from groundwater. We also have efforts underway to estimate nitrate in groundwater, which isn't exactly what you're asking, because that's talking about ambient conditions in groundwater, but kind of pairing the information about base flow amounts with amounts in nitrate amounts in shallow groundwater that can also kind of be woven together to give us additional insights into whether we're seeing changes in base flow, the volume, and also whether we're seeing changes over the long term in that shallow groundwater quality.
Right, then we have one last question online before we go to in-person group. So someone noticed that for your tracking, you're using flow normalized loads when assessing progress in reducing Gulf of Mexico hypoxia, as opposed to the actual nutrient load or mass. Could you explain the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, we also look at, I didn't get into this, but we also look at kind of what we call non-flow normalized loads, which is more the trend in this is oversimplification, but kind of actual conditions. And still with that, trend analysis of anything is always going to be about signal to noise, and there's always noise in a time series. So the stronger the signal is relative to that random noise, the more likely you are to see a trend. And you can think about temperature changes, atmospheric temperature changes, where we've seen a warming trend over time, but there are years where it's really hot, there are years where it's really cold, and you kind of got to get past that annual variation to see the kind of more systemic and sustained change over time. It's the same thing with looking at loads to the Gulf of Mexico. You can do it without flow normalization also, and see, and actually ends up being a fairly similar trend to what we're seeing with the flow normalized load trends. But with both, there are still those years, that variability from year to year that you're going to see. And so a practical way to think about this might be, let's say there's some theoretical utopian point in the future where we have some year we've reached the goal. We have some years where the zone is gone completely. Most years it's really small. Even then, we are still going to have years where it just rains a lot. It rains a lot. There's a lot of runoff. Stream flows are really high. We have floods, and there's just so much water in the river carrying more nutrients that we're going to have a larger zone at that point. So when it's important to kind of consider when you're thinking about trend results, it doesn't mean that every single year is going to be exactly the same. It means that the general trend over time has been in one direction or the other. So hopefully that gets to the gist of your question, but I'd be happy to hear more from you if you want to elaborate on that.
And are there any questions from the in-person group?
Yep, we got one.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me, Lori. Great. I noticed on the end trend causes slide that you had, several of those curves had a sequence of about 6 data points at the end, sort of 2010 on, that were very linear. It appeared again and again. And I wondered, is that an artifact of the model kind of coming close to current time and being a 5-year window, or is it something else going on?
Are you talking about the sources or the river loads?
There was the title of it was End Trend Causes, and there were multiple graphs. Well, and it showed up on the P trend causes slide also, that there are just these very straight lines or sequences of 6 data points, either going up or down, but linear. It just looked a little uncanny.
Let me share my screen.
Was it that one, or was it in the causes?
I just thought all I put down was the name of the slide. Let's see. Yeah, that's an example. So under nitrogen, the top farm fertilizer line is straight line going down gently. The nitrogen fixation line, that green line in the upper left, going up like a rocket. The crop uptake is doing similar. And then over at the river load, they're going down in both of those. And it looks like there's one value that's driving that linearity. I don't know.
Well, I can tell you that the river load time series is smooth because of that signal to noise thing. This is the signal that we're looking at here. So that's the systematic trend that we were asking the model to show us. In terms of the sources, I can only guess because this is not data that USGS is observing, so I'm not going to know exactly how the origin of all of it, but it's coming from things like the ag census, from fertilizer sales data. Again, the wastewater is coming from what I mentioned earlier, from the reporting from the facilities. Atmospheric deposition is measured through some that is ultimately derived from an observational network of atmospheric deposition sites. Crop uptakes coming from the ag census. So whenever you're introducing some subsampling or some surveying or indirect estimation of something, there is always a chance that there's some kind of artifact like you're talking about. So I wouldn't rule it out. I don't know exactly if this is real or it's some artifact. I think there's a possibility either, but
thank you very much. I think a lot of it seems to be driven by that nitrogen fixation, and I was interested in that last week when I saw you speak, Lori, about what might have been enough of a crop change for that nitrogen fixation change.
Yeah.
But it happened in the thing is, it happened since 2010.
Yeah. You know, whether it's real or it's an artifact of methodology, it's both of these are coming from at some point in the workflow from ag census data. So that could at least be a lead on like looking into this. Is there something going on with the ag census that might have introduced an artifact here?
Yeah, or is there an area of the Mississippi River Basin that we're not as familiar with where there's been a big land use change?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or big crop, I shouldn't say land use, a big crop change. Yeah.
Yeah.
Away toward a legume, away from a
Oh, yeah, somebody made a comment, soybean yields have increased in much of the last decade, so is that part of the reason? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they're, it may be their assumed fixation. If their assumed fixation is a function of yield, it might have, but the real fixation might not have. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll note that this is a side effort, but an important one. There's a number of us in EPA, USDA, a number of agencies, Cornell, Illinois, and others, where we're getting together and taking a close look at these time series, because a number of us have been estimating them in different ways over time and have found the things that work, some of the things that have kind of bothered us about the process, and some of the gaps in our ability to improve this estimation process by having additional sources of data. And there's an effort underway, just I don't want to use the term modernize, but maybe share our lessons learned here and start to think about whether there are ways we could do this estimation better. Because we are largely reliant on using indirect sources and trying to make the best estimates that we can. And we have to keep learning and improving that process. So hopefully at some point in the future, there's more that can be done here. But one of the things that I love about this topic and about interacting with groups like this that know different things than I know, there's so much here. It's such a complicated system, but such an important issue that the more you dig, the more you learn, and the more there is to kind of figure out and benefit from in terms of doing better adaptive management in the basin. So I don't know what the answer to your question is, but I think it's a great insight, and I would be interested to hear if others dig into this, or if we have a chance to dig into it more, what might be going on there.
Thank you again.
Let's see if
So on your graph right here, it looks to me like manure was about 30% of fertilizer, but on your graph of what the impact of it, manure was 40%. Can you make any comments about why manure's impact is greater than maybe it's just fertilizer?
The difference between those two graphs at a high level is that one is the one we were just looking at. That's the amount estimated to be applied on the land surface. The pie chart was the amount reaching the Gulf of Mexico. So there's not going to necessarily be a one-to-one correspondence, because in the most extreme case, and this is not happening, but let's say we were applying all of the fertilizer in the basin in Denver. Like, that's really far from the Gulf of Mexico. Not a lot of that's going to make it there, but let's say all the livestock was in Louisiana. Like, there are just the differences in the delivery in terms of where it's being applied, how far it is from the Gulf of Mexico, the tendency of the different forms of nitrogen and phosphorus associated with those sources to be transported in groundwater versus surface water, how steep the slopes are at the area of location. So there are a number of factors that can contribute to a difference between what's being applied on the land surface and what's eventually making it downstream to the Gulf.
But do we have time for
I
one
don't know,
more?
I don't know, Lori, if you have time for a couple more questions. There's still
Okay,
all right. All right. Yeah.
Well, yeah, thanks for a great presentation and very interesting. You don't mention legacy phosphorus, and it seems like everything we're reading, there's research here in Iowa and other places suggesting it's more of an issue than previously thought. So where does that fit in, or will it fit in?
Yes, so we have been working with our partners in states and EPA and USDA to tackle this. And USDA actually has, through its SEEP program, some intensive field studies around this topic. Looking more at the basin scale, we have done some sparrow modeling. It was not the model I showed you, where we tried to indirectly represent stream bank erosion as a source of phosphorus through a surrogate variable that showed that that was potentially a large source. The study I mentioned in the slide that we were just looking at, I didn't get into this part of it, but we had in our model, we tried out a number of lagged input variables of different durations and found some explanatory power from different time lags for nitrogen and phosphorus. We have the Sparrow model I mentioned that is in development now is actually a more dynamic model than the one that I showed you. So we'll be estimating over 20 years instead of 1 year, and we'll be estimating seasonally. And what that allows us to do in a dynamic fashion is include sources from different years. So basically lag sources where there are differences in time between application and arrival in the river. We piloted that in the Illinois Basin and found that I want to say this was just published, I think yesterday, 20, somewhere around 30, a third of the nitrogen and maybe a quarter of the phosphorus, and that may be wrong, so don't quote me on that. I would say go to the paper, but was estimated to be from nutrients that could have taken up to a decade to reach rivers in that part of the Mississippi River Basin. So there is a lot going on indicating that this is an important source. And now going back to sort of our more philosophical discussion about how to quantify these things in an accurate way, that's something that's really hard to quantify. The amount of phosphorus that has accumulated in farm fields or in stream channels to be able to include it as a direct source in a model with any accuracy. Likewise, for the amount of nitrogen moving through groundwater, we can use isotopes and other things to tell us the age of groundwater, to tell us more about the likely travel time between the land surface and rivers, to give us an idea of how long that's taking. We can look at the percentage of baseload to understand whether that might be a large source to a given stream reach. But we don't have wall-to-wall coverage of there's exactly this much nitrogen at this point in the aquifer system, and it's going to take this long to get to this different stream reach. So lots of growing evidence that at both small and large scales, these legacy sources are important. There are huge implications for management, right? Because these are sources that need to be managed differently if they can be managed at all. And so it's really important to figure this out, but it's also a difficult challenge. So I'm looking forward to a lot of the ongoing research where we begin to, as a scientific community, learn more about this topic, because you're right, it is likely to be very important.
I think that's it in the room, Kay, in the interest of time.
All right, and I did want to mention, somebody asked if you could provide a list to the links to the publication referenced in your presentation. And is that something, can they email you about?
Yeah, can I put it in the chat?
Oh, of course, yes.
End, or I may not have access to the chat once we end. So yes, you can email me. I'd be happy to do that. And I'll also share them with you just in case there's a way for you to more broadly send that out.
All right, that sounds great. So you can email either of us if eventually to get those publication links. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. A lot of comments that it was a great presentation. And we'll end it there.
All right, thank you so